Hello, my name is John Torpey, and I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies and of the European Union Studies Center here at the CUNY Graduate Center, the City University of New York. Welcome to the final installment of our three-part lecture series on Weimar and Us, Lessons for Today from Interwar Germany. We are recording this interview on Monday, November 4th, the day before the elections in the United States. And I want to therefore say that much may change with the election tomorrow. The idea for this series came to us as we pondered a few months ago a call for proposals from the German embassy in the United States for funding on Germany-themed topics from its program, Germany on Campus. Given the frequency with which the comparison is made, we thought it might be useful to examine possible similarities as well as differences between our own situation and that of Weimar Germany, which famously had a brief and storied life between 1918 and 1933, but which vanished as the Nazis came to power in that year. We applied for the grant and received it, and that is what's covering the expenses of our distinguished invited speakers. I therefore want to begin by thanking the German embassy for its support of these events. I also want to thank the DAAD, that is the German Academic Exchange Service Alumni Association, and its president, Manfred Philipp, for its support or their support in publicizing the events. I finally want to thank a number of people without whose help these events would not be possible. They are the EU Studies Center and at the EU Studies Center and the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, Eli Karetny, our administrative director, Luke Shelminski, the associate director of the EU Studies Center, Juan Acevedo, our graduate student assistant extraordinaire, and Claire Centofanti, who is at the controls as we speak. Let me now introduce our distinguished speaker for this installment of the conversation. Sheri Berman is professor of political science at Barnard College of Columbia University. Her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She's written about all these topics for a wide range of scholarly and non-scholarly publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. She currently serves on the boards of the journals, the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science Quarterly. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, From the Ancien Regime to the Present Day, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. So we will have a Q&A between Professor Berman and myself for perhaps 45 minutes. Because we're not recording this live, there will be no Q&A with an audience. Thank you once again for viewing this conversation, and we hope you find it informative. So let me turn to some questions for Professor Berman. First of all, I would say that the two previous speakers, Isabel Hull of Cornell University and David Abraham of the University of Miami, left us, I think, some very important lessons in regard to a comparison between our own situation and that of Weimar Germany. Isabel Hull argued that there were many more freelance wielders of violence, so to speak, relative to the size of the official armed forces in Weimar Germany, whereas our situation is very much the opposite, suggesting that the threat of political violence today is real, but rather limited in comparison, certainly. Meanwhile, David Abraham argued that the threat of fascism, which has bubbled up, the concern about fascism has bubbled up, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, that the threat of fascism was limited in our situation in the sense that historical fascism was in considerable part a right-wing response to a left-wing threat, whereas today, he argues, there's relatively little in the way of a threat from the left in the United States, and suggesting, therefore, a limited fascist threat. So, Professor Berman, to you, many people, let's start with the general kind of question. Many people today are comparing our situation, that is in the United States, to that of Weimar Germany, in the sense that the latter, that is Weimar, went from democracy to Nazism in a few short years. Do you think the Weimar experience has anything to say to our own?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and for doing this conversation via Zoom. So let me answer your question by saying, yes, it has something to teach us, but we should be cautious in the lessons that we take. So to start off with the obvious, the Weimar Republic was born in the aftermath of the First World War, a war that Germany lost. And this is important because this democracy was born in perhaps the most inauspicious circumstances one could imagine for a democracy. A lost war and the humiliation that went with it, the incredible destruction of the war. Millions of people died during the war. The country was completely devastated at the end. Famine-like conditions had reigned in the country towards the end of the war. Hundreds of thousands of people died just of starvation. And then, of course, as unfortunately many of us now do know, there was also a pandemic that exploded at the end of the war that killed many, many more people. Germany, therefore, started its life as a democracy, the first German democracy that existed, in these terrible conditions. It was also, by that point, already embedded in this society, in this new democracy, right and left-wing extremists. That is to say, what would become communists, because of course the Russian Revolution had just happened, and right-wing extremists carried over from the pre-World War I period, but whose ranks and radicalism grew as a result of the war, and in particular after the war, by many returning soldiers. And of course, Adolf Hitler would turn out to be the most notable of them. So I think we should remember that this Weimar Republic was not only Germany's first try at democracy, that is to say, this was a country without previous democratic experience, but it was born again in the worst possible circumstances, and then had to live through an interwar period that was constantly plagued by economic crises, political extremism, constant violence, a variety of international shocks. So this really, it's hard to really imagine a democratic experiment that had more strikes against it. I guess 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, this democracy started, I would say, with about, 50 already against it, in a way that it survived as long as it did on some level is almost kind of miraculous. So I wouldn't want to overdo the comparison simply because we are dealing with a very different world in 2024 in the United States than the Germans were dealing with between the period of 1918 and 1933. So that's the kind of don't overdraw the lessons. However, there are, I think, important lessons that one can and should legitimately draw from the Weimar experience that are relevant to us today. The most basic one is that democracy is very fragile. Okay, so it was very fragile in Weimar for all the reasons that I said, but democracy is not something that just exists free floating from the people, the voters, and the elites that make it up. It can fail. And it was in a way, almost overdetermined in interwar Germany, but it can fail. And that's something that all democratic failures should remind those of us who live in democracies. So there's that lesson. It's somewhat straightforward, maybe even a little banal, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that fact, that democracy requires constant cultivation and reinforcement. More specifically, I will say that there are other lessons that Weimar should teach us. One is that, if elites make bad decisions, if they do not put democracy before their own particular interests, very bad things can happen. The lesson of Weimar's endgame is that conservatives made some very bad decisions. They were so eager to get rid of German democracy. They were so eager to defeat the left that they decided to make deals with the Nazi Party, and in particular to allow Adolf Hitler to come to power under conditions of his own choosing, in the belief that they would be able to use him to achieve their own conservative anti-democratic ends, not necessarily fascist ones. This was a tragic mistake for Germany, for the world, and, by the way, for the conservatives themselves, who ended up getting destroyed by Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists when they came to power. So very, very important that elites, political decision makers, recognize that, putting your own interests above the interest of democracy is a very dangerous game, because you do not know what will happen when democracy disappears. You lose your ability to keep competing, and democracy is the only system that allows societies to solve their differences peacefully. And so part of the blame for the end of the Weimar Republic has to go with conservatives who decided to allow democracy to end under the false belief that they could use the Nazis to achieve their own particular ends. This was a bad decision for Germany, and it was a bad decision for themselves. And I think the important lesson there is you must always put the interests of democracy above your own particular interests.
Right. Very interesting. I mean, so you've mentioned that this was Weimar, that is, was Germany's first stab, so to speak, at democracy, and had many strikes against it as it got started. But I wonder, maybe you could say a little bit about your sense of what I think you called the fragility of American democracy. Or maybe you were talking about the fragility of democracy generally, but let's talk about the United States and the quality, shall we say, of its democracy. I mean, my first reaction to a comparison between Weimar and the United States in the contemporary period is that, we've been at this a lot longer. Now, that's different from saying it's been the most robust democracy. I mean, obviously, until the Civil War, Black people were not basically allowed to vote. And it took another 100 years, really, after the end of slavery to essentially guarantee them the right to do that and to make it an effective thing as a practical matter. So, we've had some kind of democracy for a long time, but we've also had a lot of shortcomings to that democracy, and race is obviously a central feature of those shortcomings. So I wonder, how would you assess the quality of our democracy going into this period of turbulence and difficulty?
So let me step back from that and contextualize that with the first part of your question. So it is generally the case that the longer lived a democracy is, the more resilient it is. There are obvious reasons for that. Institutions and norms gain strength and legitimacy over time. Building new institutions from scratch, the institutions of democracy, political parties, an active civil society, a free press, separation of powers, a strong judiciary. All of these things are necessary for democracy. And, when you build them for the first time, it's a very difficult thing to do. Similarly, the norms of democracy, toleration, compromise, and acceptance that everybody who is a citizen has equal rights and equal responsibilities, regardless of their background, regardless of their political preferences. These are things that take time to become anchored in society, in citizens' beliefs, in the behavior of elites. And the longer these things exist, the more likely they are to develop, like I said, that kind of anchoring, that kind of legitimacy, that kind of stability. To get back to the interwar period, for example, we all know that many democracies died during the interwar years. But what's important to recognize is that the democracies that died during the interwar years, like the Weimar Republic, were all new democracies. That is to say, the democracies that died between 1918 and 1940, let's say, these were all democracies that were essentially new, where these were, that is to say, emerged in countries where there had been little, if no, experience with democracy beforehand. Now, again, correlation, as we social scientists like to say, does not equal causality. Just because something is related to something else doesn't mean that one of them causes the other. But the reason for that causality, like I said, lies in those things that I discussed before, which is generally over time, if institutions and norms continue to exist, they continue to gain legitimacy, adaptability, anchoring in society and citizens, and that makes democracy overall more resilient. So that brings us back to the question of the United States and this other question that came up before of fragility. I think democracy in the United States is much more resilient, that is to say, much less fragile than that of the Weimar Republic, right? That seems to me trivial and on some level, although as we discussed before, I think it needs to be kind of reiterated. But democracy does require a constant belief in and acceptance of those institutions and norms. And as we can see, those things can break down even in places where they have existed for a long time. As you said, look, the United States has not, by the criteria of political scientists, the United States did not start off as a full democracy. It started off as a partial democracy. This is certainly true up through the Civil War when, the South was not democratic at all. It was a racial oligarchy. And then it became democratic in name, but not in reality. After the Civil War, it was not until obviously the civil rights movement of the 1960s that all American citizens, to get back to a point that I made before, actually were able to exercise the rights that they were ostensibly entitled to as citizens, right? So partial democracy up through, let's say, the 1960s, but still, again, those institutions and those norms were there, and they had an ability to, again, persevere through time, gain legitimacy, gain experience dealing with challenges, gain anchoring in society. So you expect the American democracy to be more resilient as a result of that, but it can and has indeed weakened over time, particularly over the last several electoral cycles, as a result of the purposeful attempt to undermine or to weaken many of those democratic norms and institutions. And that what makes social scientists and political scientists worry about democracy today, not the policies that one party or another advocates, whether you're for abortion or against abortion, whether you are pro-religious rights as opposed to more libertarian, whether whatever. None of those things are questions about democracy. What's important from a political science perspective in assessing the strength of democracy is whether or not all of the parties, all of the elites, and the citizens are willing to play by the democratic rules of the game. And we as political scientists worry more about that in the United States than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, yada, yada.
Right. So there's greater fragility in our system, despite its long-standing, existence and persistence. And I definitely agree with that. And I guess I wonder, I want to ask a question about what might be causing this, relatively recent bout, so to speak, of fragility. And, one thing that comes to mind, certainly for me, I'm thinking back to the history of Weimar, is the Great Recession. I mean, the Great Recession was not as bad an economic, disaster as the Great Depression. But nonetheless, I don't know about you, but I'll never forget coming home from the office that I'm sitting in, whatever that is, 16 years ago now, wondering whether I was going to turn on the news and they were going to announce that the world economy had collapsed, and trying to figure out what that might mean. But in any case, a lot of people faced serious hardship, serious difficulty, lost a lot. Meanwhile, the banks got, taken care of, and a lot of people weren't so thrilled about that prioritization of our response to the crisis. So I wonder how much you think the Great Recession or other, COVID is obviously another shock to the system that one could point to, but Donald Trump, a major kind of challenger, I would say, to both parties in 2016, had arrived on the scene in 2016 and made a splash, along with a guy named Bernie Sanders, who many people thought of as much the same kind of guy as Donald Trump. So, and voted for, the two of them in different elections. So I wonder what you would point to as the kind of shocks, the kinds of challenges to the system that might have brought on this most recent bout of turbulence.
Mm-hmm. So again, since we're doing this in the context of a discussion about Weimar, let me start with some context there, right? So the National Socialist Party had existed in Germany, obviously, before the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in 1923. There are actually a whole variety of, as I mentioned, both right and left-wing extremist groups that existed in Germany committed to overthrowing the Weimar Republic. And these parties constantly made trouble throughout the Weimar Republic's life, up through the onset of the Great Depression. Assassinations, constant street brawling, communist and right-wing uprising, putsches, all those kinds of things. So the Weimar Republic was constantly buffered by these things. But up through the Great Depression, right, the classic breaking point here is the 1928 elections. The Nazis themselves, despite making all of this trouble, right, were unable to get more than 2.6, 2.8% of the vote. And what the Great Depression does is it enables or provides a context within which all of these dangerous trends that had been brewing could really explode. So, when we talk about the end of the Weimar Republic, if you're trying to write another one of the many thousands of books that have been written about it, you really need to think about, sort of long, short-term, and medium, long-term causes, short-term causes, medium-term causes. There's simply no doubt in my mind that without the chaos of the Great Depression, the Nazis would have been still a malignant and dangerous force, but the outcome of the Weimar Republic would have been very different. Maybe not democratic, perhaps a conservative type of reaction, but the Nazis really are turbocharged, as are the communists, by the intense suffering and disorder that the Great Depression brings forth in Germany. But the Great Depression alone obviously is not enough. The two countries that suffered the most from the Great Depression, the United States and Germany, obviously went in very different directions. We not only had a stronger democracy in the US, but FDR reacts to the Depression in ways that are very much designed to kind of beat back anti-democratic forces. So, you really need to think of a combination of factors when you try to understand something as complicated as why one democracy fails and the other democracy succeeds. So that brings us back to the Great Recession. It obviously was nowhere near as painful and as disruptive as the Great Depression was. Although, as you said, I'm also old enough to remember thinking, holy crap, are we on the verge of something like that? Is our banking system going to collapse? Are our economies going to go into free fall? Now, there was incredible suffering unleashed by the financial crisis of 2008. Actually, in some countries more than others, Greece, for instance, went through an economic downturn that was in many ways worse than even what Germany suffered during the Great Depression. So we suffered a lot in the United States, but other places suffered even more. But in general, as a global phenomenon, it turned out not to be as bad as the Great Depression. That said, what we can see after 2008 is a lot of trends that existed before becoming more turbocharged. So the Republican Party had what we would now consider to be, for example, right-wing populist elements in it. That is to say, parts of the party that were really determined to not just disagree with Democrats, but to demonize them, to try to really rile up their supporters on the basis of kind of negative appeals rather than positive appeals. Those existed before the financial crisis, but with the Tea Party and a lot of other movements, we see those things becoming more and more prominent. We see also, as you mentioned, on the left, an increasing swing to the left on a variety of issues, the anger and frustration that comes from the dislocation of the post-2008 financial crisis, combined again with a sense that elites are more responsive to the needs of other elites than they are to the needs of the average person. Very, very dangerous trend. And again, as you mentioned, that feeds both support for more populism on the right, as well as the Bernie Sanders, sort of crusade / campaign within the Democratic Party. So it seems to me like that is an important triggering effect. And then, of course, also it does turbocharge other kinds of trends, the hollowing out of many American communities, the increasing divergence between rural and urban areas, the increasing divergence between the incomes of people at the top and people at the bottom, where the people at the top do increasingly well and the people at the bottom have to continue to struggle. So absolutely a crucial part of this story, even if, again, thankfully not as destructive as the Great Depression in the 1930s was.
Absolutely agree. But another aspect of all this is that this is not just the United States. This is not just happening in the United States. So yes, we departed from a comparison with between ourselves and Weimar Germany, but there are also contemporaneous comparisons. That is to say, really, I think similarities of important kinds, and in particular, the kind of collapse in some ways, or at least transformation of party systems in such a way that, the sort of left parties have tended to lose their traditional working class voting bases, and those voters have tended to drift into conservative parties, often driven by concerns about immigration. Which may be a rational concern from the point of view of a worker who may be concerned about losing his job to to an immigrant or to immigrants more generally. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how you see this in comparative terms, across the map in our own day, and if there's anything particularly distinctive about the situation in the United States as compared to what's going on in France or Germany or the UK or elsewhere.
So that's another great way to think about comparisons, right? Which is that if we see the same thing happening in a lot of different contexts, then that's an indication that there's some broad trends that are driving it, right? That is to say, trends that are not specific to the United States or France or Germany, right? And certainly one of the trends that we see is the rise of what might be considered, again, broadly right-wing populist parties. So in the United States, that, because we have a two-party system, because of our electoral system, that trend has manifested itself in a shift in the nature of the Republican Party. In other countries where you have proportional representation systems, that's manifested itself in the growth of explicitly, distinctively separate right-wing populist parties, separate from the sort of traditional center-right parties that existed, Christian Democratic or conservative parties, right? But we see that trend everywhere. Right. So we know, therefore, that there's something broad going on. And some of those broad things are things that we've already talked about, right? Which is, I would say, economic issues are important if oftentimes in sort of indirect ways. And similarly, we see sort of what you might consider to be social and cultural grievances, kind of a very large part of these right-wing populist parties' agendas, immigration in particular. And I would say, even though obviously screaming and yelling about immigration is a significant part of Trump's appeal, so to speak, it's even more central in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, where immigration is really the issue that these parties thrive on. And I would say there's two things going on there. In Western Europe, even more than the United States, the sort of demographic change over the last, generation or so is really quite dramatic, for better or worse, sometimes better, oftentimes worse. Americans have not, we've been a country of immigrants in the United States. We've dealt with it sometimes better and sometimes worse, but we at least have some experience as being a country that has sort of over time absorbed immigrants from, different parts of the world. This was not the case in most West European countries, but that has been the case over the past generation or two. So this is a really dramatic social, cultural, and demographic change. And one has to recognize that, because sometimes it's just difficult to deal with change. But that has also come with some very specific challenges that I would definitely not equate simply with, whatever racism or xenophobia. These challenges include things like strains on government resources at a time, as we've already discussed, when budgets are tight, when economic times are difficult. It's come with real difficulties separating legitimate asylum seekers from illegal immigrants. Rates of illegal immigration in Europe are very, very high, just like they are in the United States. Also very difficult in Europe is a lot of people come as asylum seekers. They have their applications denied. They're deemed, sort of not suitable, and they never leave. And these are real problems that citizens can legitimately be concerned about, and that governments, whatever you want to say, established parties, have not done a very good job dealing with. And this has left right-wing populists, I think, with a bunch of issues and grievances that they can exploit. So again, I would say it's a toxic combination of difficult economic times, rapid social, cultural, and demographic changes, and most of all, perhaps, is the inability of established parties on the center left and center right to kind of come up with good solutions to these problems. And that brings up this question that you said of center left parties. These parties have undergone a dramatic transformation, as you mentioned, over the past generation or so. I mean, if one were to go back to the, sort of pre-1990s era, center left parties, Labor Party, Socialist Party, Social Democratic parties, these were parties of working class voters, not exclusively, but that was sort of their core. They are not anymore. They are now parties, as we've discussed and many others have discussed, of what Thomas Piketty and others have called the Brahmin elite. That is to say, highly educated, generally middle-class voters, who are quite progressive on social and cultural issues, also generally progressive on economic issues. And it's a very different type of voting base than that of the center left. And what has happened is, over the course of a generation or so, many of those working class voters are now solidly in the populist right camp. Really changes the dynamic of politics and changes the way the party system is structured.
And I mean, I again agree with that analysis and wonder, what's your explanation for why this has happened? I mean, obviously, at some level, since around 1960, there's been an explosion of access to higher education opportunities across the countries that we're talking about. And it used to be the case in left politics that people worried about kind of their alliances between these two, between sort of the educated intellectuals and working class people. But it seems in a way that over time that link has kind of gotten very soft. And, as you've already explained, I mean, there's this kind of gap between economic progressivism on sort of the working class side and social progressivism or liberalism on the more educated side. And that has led to tensions in, for example, the Democratic Party coalition, such that they seem to be losing working class voters, indeed non-white working class voters, to the right. So I wonder if you could talk about that dynamic and how you understand or how you explain why that's happened.
So another really good comparison that you mentioned there, right, which is we talk a lot in the United States about white working class voters having shifted gradually and then suddenly, as the saying goes, to the Republican Party. Well, that's happened in Europe as well. So again, there's something broader going on here, right? The white working class vote, or as we talk about it more often these days, low educated voters have really now shifted from the center left in Western Europe to, many of them. In fact, in some cases, in many European countries, a majority of them to the populist right. So this is a broad or, a cross-Atlantic trend. So the question is why. There's a lot of things going on here. One thing that I would start with is that, not beginning, but really perhaps most obviously in the 1990s, we saw center-left parties kind of really shift their economic profiles. This is the third way era of Blair, of Clinton, and Schroeder. And so these trends had been going on for a while. But in the 1990s, what you really see is the center-left changing the way it presents itself to voters, the types of policies it offers voters. And this really, again, accelerates this trend of white working class voters leaving these parties for somewhere else. These were times when these parties were presenting themselves, center-left parties, that is to say, as sort of centrist on the economy, a sort of soft neoliberalism. It was called progressive neoliberalism sometimes in the United States. Again, as I mentioned, third wayism in Britain. And this really kind of changed the way voters viewed parties. They weren't, center right and center left were no longer all that different on economic issues. They were kind of offering, a little bit of, one was a little bit more left, one was a little bit more right, but they were essentially offering the same things. And this really, I think, turned off some voters. It also focused voters' attention even more on social and cultural issues, because that was a place where these parties really did differ. Also important is in the 1990s, these parties, center-left parties, which had been, again, sort of presented themselves at the very least, particularly in Western Europe, more in Western Europe than in the United States. It's kind of, parties that championed the working class. They became led by people like, presumably, who would listen to a discussion like this, highly educated people, middle-class people. And, these were people who were really quite progressive on social and cultural issues, often much more progressive than the rest of the electorate, even their own electorate. And so the way that these parties present themselves changes, the voters they attract change. As the voters they attract change, the parties change more. I mean, the Democrats now, because they rely so much more on people like, again, the folks who are listening to something like this, as opposed to white working class voters, they really need to have to balance the kinds of things that they offer. And this, it creates a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that's not impossible to break, but it is indeed difficult to break.
Indeed. So now I want to switch gears a little bit to what may veer into the predictive. So I know you don't really want to be in that position, but in the last few weeks, as I mentioned, I think in my intro, the notion of fascism has arisen in public debate. We've had a discussion, charges about something called Antifa over the last few years. But Antifa is something very different than, what it really originally was in Germany. But in any case, the question is, are we looking at something that you would call fascism? What does that mean? And, do you see that really kind of on the horizon for us or not? Again, I have my thoughts, but you're the expert, so I'd rather ask you. And as I say, it is, since we're talking about this the day before the election, there's a certain way in which, this is unavoidably a predictive sort of question. But, at some level, there was a piece in the New York Times basically reflecting on the thoughts about this issue of one of the leading experts historically on fascism, Robert Paxton, your colleague at Columbia. And he seemed to be pretty enthusiastic about the idea that it really applies in the current situation. Whether it makes sense to use it for political purposes is a different question. So I'd like to ask you the same two questions. Is it the case on the one side, and on the other side, is it wise to introduce this into the discussion?
So look, Robert Paxton is one of the foremost historians of fascism. So anything that he says should be taken seriously. I'm less enthusiastic about using that term than he is, because I still see some major differences both between, let's say, the Republican Party and Donald Trump, which is what that term is, what many of these folks are referring to, and whatever, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, fascists, National Socialists, and also, to get back to something that we discussed before, the times that we are in, as difficult as they are, as filled with crisis as they are really nothing like the interwar period. And that matters because radicalism thrives off disorder. It thrives off suffering. It thrives off really very bad times. Like, there's a direct correlation between how bad off a country is and how many people are willing to buy into radical and revolutionary movements. So I don't like that term. I don't think, if we think about what fascism has historically meant, the kind of movements and politicians that it has been applied to, I don't think we are there yet. Now, that, I want to say, does not mean that I don't think our situation is dangerous. Authoritarianism is not fascism. That is to say, there are authoritarians and authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, that are not fascist. All fascist and National Socialists are by definition authoritarian, but those two things should not be conflated. So I think Donald Trump, as an individual, is a person who does not care at all about democracy. He would get rid of it, the Constitution, the democratic institutions and norms I discussed before, in a minute if he could, because he does not care about them at all. And he has unfortunately been able to bring along most of the current Republican Party with him. They seem very willing to indulge him in these kinds of things, even though I have to assume that many, if not most of them, understand that what they're doing is sacrificing democratic norms and institutions simply to ensure that the Republican Party remains in power. So I find this situation extremely disappointing and extremely dangerous. I don't like to use the term fascism and National Socialism, not because I don't think that we should be alarmed, but rather because I think that historically we are not there yet. And I don't believe in, sort of whatever you want to call it, term. We talk a lot about great inflation in the academy. We talk about sort of terminological expansion. I like to be a little bit more exact. What I see is a real threat of democratic decay and even decline. What I see is a party that is willing to accept and even encourage explicitly anti-democratic actions. But I don't see, something that at this point, is akin to what we saw in the interwar period in places like Italy and Germany.
Do you see this kind of thing? Something that more meets, whatever definition you would, and obviously it would be an exacting definition elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in Europe primarily.
Well, there are surely parties that are even more explicitly anti-democratic, more explicitly racist and xenophobic, more explicitly ethno-nationalist or whatever. Absolutely. There are right-wing parties in Europe that have fit into that category recently. I would say the AfD in Germany really is close to skirting that edge. In fact, so noxious is it that other right-wing parties in Europe don't want to have anything to do with it. There have been many smaller parties in the past, Golden Dawn in a place like Greece, and smaller neo-Nazi, explicitly neo-Nazi movements in other parts of Europe. They've existed for sure. Were not able to gain power. But, something like the AfD in Germany, I would say, is even more explicit in its xenophobia, its racism, and other kinds of things. Interestingly enough, however, though, that party has not done other things. It has not, it has not questioned the outcome of elections, for instance. Now that may have to do with a variety of, institutional features of the German political system, but that party has thus far not done some things that even, again, Trump and the current Republican Party have been willing to do.
Right. Well, I think that's a wrap from my perspective. I thought this was a fascinating conversation. I want to thank Sheri Berman from Barnard College, Columbia University, for her willingness to take the time to have this conversation. I think it's been extraordinarily illuminating. I think particularly the comparisons, which obviously both of us are very invested in, as a way of illuminating, what's going on in the world. And I think it's been very illuminating, and I hope listeners find it that way. So let me thank Claire Centofanti for her expertise at the controls. And thank you all for listening in to this last of the installments of our series, Weimar and Us, Lessons for Today from Interwar Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you.